The first thing anyone noticed wasn't the shouting or the metal doors, it was the way his eyes never focused on anything that stayed still. That was how people described Damon Rivera the morning they brought him into Rikers. He was 23, severely schizophrenic, and already terrified before the intake officer even called his name. By the time they walked him through the bridge, past the razor wire curling like rusted thorns, he was whispering to someone who wasn't there. And on Rikers, that made him a target. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. Within hours, the officers labeled him non-compliant. Not sick. Not unstable. Just a problem. He froze during orders. He flinched at movement. He covered his ears when the dorm exploded into its usual chaos, beds slamming, buckets scraping, men yelling over each other for commissary, food, or nothing at all. To the people running the unit, it looked like defiance. To anyone trained in mental health, it was a young man spiraling. They gave him no therapy, no counselor, no consistent medication. What they gave him instead was a cell at the far end of the corridor, one of the quiet rooms, a nickname that never matched reality. The light above his door flickered nonstop. The vent rattled like metal teeth. The shouting from down the tier rolled in waves, day and night. Damon lasted 4 days before the cracks started to show. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He pressed his head against the wall to drown out the voices and the noise, and then he stopped responding to officers altogether. The captain on duty wrote it up as intentional refusal. So they moved him again. This time, to a deeper part of the jail. A wing where the doors stayed closed a little too long, where the hallway cameras sometimes malfunctioned, and where inmates with psychiatric conditions were sent when staff didn't know what else to do. Some called it segregation. Others called it punishment. Damon never understood the difference. On his first night in that isolation cell, he whispered through the crack under the door, begging for help from anyone who passed. But the corridor stayed silent. Even the officers avoided looking in his direction. And by morning, something had changed. Something the jail couldn't ignore anymore. Because when they opened the slot to deliver breakfast, Damon didn't move at all. He just stared straight ahead, unblinking, silent, and unreachable. The officer hesitated, then stepped back, muttering for medical. What happened next would expose the part of Rikers no one wanted to talk about. When the medical team finally arrived at Damon's cell, they found him sitting upright, eyes glassy, hands shaking in small repetitive motions. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't aggressive. He was in the middle of a full psychiatric collapse. But at Rikers, the line between crisis and discipline was paper thin. The nurse who examined him, a woman who'd been there long enough to stop pretending things would improve, requested a mental health observation bed. The officer escorting her dismissed it immediately. "Put him on watch in the block," he said. "We're short-staffed. He'll be fine." That was the unofficial system inside Rikers. Medical might suggest care, but custody made the final call. And custody didn't have the time, training, or patience for someone like Damon. Hours later, he was back in his isolation cell. By afternoon, the tension in the unit shifted. Officers were whispering. Inmates were watching. Something had happened overnight, something Damon had never seen but was about to feel the consequences of. Another detainee in the wing, also mentally ill, had been extracted the night before after refusing orders. The extraction team went in hard, shields, cuffs, restraints. Word spread quickly that the man was now in the infirmary with injuries no one wanted to describe out loud. The message to the rest of the block was simple: if you can't control yourself, they will control you for you. For Damon, the pressure only grew. He began knocking on his door, not out of aggression but confusion, trying to ask for medication he never received. Officers treated it as disruption. One of them threatened to write him up for refusing to maintain order. Every 8 seconds, the atmosphere flipped, from quiet to screaming. From routine to confrontation. From a cell block to a pressure cooker. And in that chaos, Damon started hearing things that weren't real and seeing shadows that didn't exist. He muttered apologies to no one, then fell into stretches of eerie silence that scared even the inmates who'd seen everything. Days passed like that, unmedicated, unmonitored, barely checked on. Then came the afternoon that changed the narrative entirely. A civilian mental health clinician entered the unit unannounced. She was there for routine checks, clipboard in hand, scanning each cell. When she reached Damon's door, she froze. His mattress was on the floor. His tray untouched. His face pale, exhausted, defeated. But it was his wrists that stopped her cold. He had been rubbing them raw against the rough fabric of his jumpsuit, unaware he was doing it, dragging the same path over and over in a loop only he understood. She demanded immediate transfer to the mental health unit. The sergeant pushed back. "Not happening today," he said. "We're full." She stepped closer, unafraid, and said, "If you leave him here, you'll be dealing with a fatality, not a transfer." That sentence cut through the entire block. The sergeant stiffened. Officers exchanged looks that carried a truth they rarely admitted. They had seen this before. But before she could escalate the situation to the captain, one officer whispered something to the sergeant that shifted everything. "Check the log. His name's not in the duty reports for 2 days." The sergeant's face changed. Someone had stopped documenting Damon's condition. Someone had erased him on paper. And the clinician realized she wasn't just dealing with neglect, she was standing in the middle of a cover-up. The moment the clinician heard that Damon's name had disappeared from the logbook, everything around her seemed to slow. Missing paperwork wasn't a clerical error on Rikers Island, it was a warning sign. A signal that someone didn't want a record of what had happened inside that cell. She demanded the sergeant open Damon's door. When it finally swung open, the smell of stale air and unwashed fabric drifted out, the scent of someone who hadn't been cared for, watched, or even acknowledged. Damon didn't look up. He didn't react at all. He sat slouched against the wall, lost in a place far beyond the reach of officers, clinicians, or anyone else. The sergeant muttered something under his breath, something about how Damon looked fine earlier. But the clinician wasn't listening anymore. She was already calling for an emergency psychiatric team, bypassing custody entirely. That sparked immediate tension. Officers stepped in, insisting he could be moved once the shift changed. She pushed back harder, voice steady, frustration barely controlled. "You removed him from documentation," she said. "You hid his deterioration. You don't get to delay this." The hallway fell silent. For the first time since arriving in that unit, Damon was no longer invisible. Not because the system recognized him, but because a single staff member refused to look away. Minutes later, under a pressure none of them could ignore, medical responders arrived. They carried Damon out on a rolling chair, his eyes unfocused, his head tilting towards sounds only he seemed to hear. Even then, he whispered something no one could make out. It was soft, apologetic, a voice shaped by fear, not intent. Word spread across the jail within hours. An inmate with severe psychiatric illness had gone largely unmonitored. His logs were blank. His medication was inconsistent. And he had been isolated until he broke. An internal inquiry followed, not because the jail volunteered transparency, but because the clinician filed a report that forced the issue. Officers suddenly remembered conversations they never wrote down. Supervisors suddenly found documentation that had been misplaced. But none of it changed the truth. Rikers had taken a young man whose illness required treatment and placed him in an environment guaranteed to make him worse. Not out of malice. Not out of intent. But out of a long-standing system that treated mental illness as misbehavior, not a medical crisis. Damon was eventually moved to a hospital ward. It took weeks before he could hold a conversation longer than a few words. He never returned to general population. He never returned to the cell where the light flickered and the noise clawed at his mind. But the damage of those days stayed with him, shadows he could never fully escape. And the jail? It went back to its routine. New intakes arrived. New crises unfolded. New names filled the logbooks, until some of them didn't. Damon became one story in a place overflowing with them, a reminder of what happens when a facility built for punishment becomes the largest mental health institution in a city that never meant for it to be one. A place where silence can be deadly. And where being forgotten is sometimes the real danger. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.